Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and support me on Locals, Subscribe Star, and Buy Me a Coffee. And also, don't forget to check out my Substack. I'm once again joined by Wandering Panda and John Slaughter Esq. This is a follow-up video to our video on July the 12th about soldier versus warrior, a question of definitions. I'll just give a brief recap of where we ended. We sort of ended with slightly different nuances, even though we sort of could all agree that, say, a samurai warrior or a medieval knight was a warrior. There were nuances and other things that we were still trying to tease out. So we decided that it was worth our while to have a follow-up. So glad to have you guys back, Wandering Panda and John Slaughter. Where can people find you?
Go ahead, Wandering Panda.
All right. Well, you can find me wander around out on X, and you'll just find me at Wander Mr. Panda. And I'm usually taking up too much time, so y'all have fun.
You can find me at on X as well at J Slaughter Esquire, and then you can find my Substack at TexasJohnSlaughterSubstack.com.
All right. So, Wandering Panda, you came up with this Venn diagram after our first show. So why don't you just sort of unpack all that means?
Sure. So after the first one, I asked a lot of questions on that one, and I was kind of trying to tease out what's going on. And so this Venn diagram is closer to what I'm trying to express, and I know it can get lost in my ramblings, but sort of I think there's three major dimensions to the idea of warrior, and I think we were all fairly close on that. But the idea of the spiritual, the social, and the martial, and you can find the big overlap in the different areas. And so on the material side, I mean, we have ability, we have training, we have discipline, but then where they all come together, in my mind, the four major spots were going to be duty, symbolic, honor, and acceptance of violence. And what I didn't do a good job of presenting on this diagram was that I think a lot of this is honestly, it's an external capacity that is placed on an individual by their particular society. And so maybe the two biggest ones in here would be the acceptance of violence, spanning between the individual within the martial and then the spiritual realm of society, as well as the social portion of a particular society, and then symbolic. And that sort of plays into the idea that, yeah, within the hierarchy of a particular civilization, I'm not going to sit here and claim that warriors are the apex of the hierarchy per se, but within a particular society, they are representing sort of the Anselmian, what is the good, what is the best idea of what could be occurring within a civilization.
Okay, so I have a couple clarifying questions here looking at this diagram. So the middle four, you said would be like the true warrior. So we have the spiritual, which is just contained in itself, the martial, which is just contained in itself, and the social, which is just contained in itself. What would those three, what persons would be represented in those three? Say, would this be fair? The spiritual just by itself might be a quote prayer warrior, someone who just prays and does spiritual stuff. Martial by itself might just be a soldier, and social by itself might just be any professional in society. And right, that they're not overlapping with anything. Yeah, those parts of the circles.
More or less, you're dead on there. The only thing I would say is I would tweak spiritual into what I was intending to represent there, especially with national faith, is whether that is the Buddhist monks or whether it is the Catholic Church in Germany or whatever. The particular religion within that civilization is recognizing the individual as a warrior, which falls into their whole acceptance of violence. They're willing to allow that person to act violently on their behalf and as a representation of the civilization.
Okay, so when the martial overlaps with the spiritual and not the social, that would be like a warrior monk, right? Like a Templar, right?
Potentially, or it can even be just a higher view of that, 30,000 feet, and that there can be discipline both within the martial, which is just training with weapons, whatever, and there can be discipline within the spiritual, which is given over to fasting, into prayer, into different acts of charity.
Okay, so in the spiritual overlaps with the social, and only those 2 points, you have aristocratic. So would that be like just somewhat of the nobility, but that's more of a hereditary position with little to no practical value?
Ish. That is sort of a harder one, in that it's almost the idea of the town monk, the local father, to some degree that could carry aspects of the head of Britain being the head of the English church, something along those lines.
Okay, and then when the martial overlaps with the social training and recognition, that would be like modern day American professional soldiers, right?
Not necessarily. In that, I was saying, even if you went to blacksmith, carpenter, something. So there's a lifestyle that is lived in, we're not going to call it discipline per se, but in skilled craftsmanship.
All right. Okay. I just want to get all those things clarified.
Sure.
So John Slaughter, with all of these component clarifications, what are your thoughts on Wandering Panda's Venn diagram?
I think it does a good job of sort of defining each one of these, necessary aspects of what makes up a warrior and how they sort of intersect, and how I think it does a good job of kind of giving you the ability to sort of define the individuals that could be, isolated in one of these circles or in overlapping circles. I think what I want a little bit more clarification though on from Panda here is on the aristocratic side, right, where you have this overlap here. What I'm thinking, if I'm trying to think of somebody that embodies this in the closest embodiment of this in the modern sense, I think of almost Eric Prince, right, minus the spiritual. Would that be something that you would agree with? Because he has the social capital, right? He's sort of an aristocrat to as much as insofar as we have them, and he has the martial ability, and he is religious, but that's not a giant aspect of who he is. So I wouldn't put him in the religious part.
Sure. So in fairness, I'm not super familiar with Prince. I think I've only seen like a podcast or 2 with him. My understanding is he's the original founder of Blackwater before it became Z. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean he comes from a rich family. Like his dad invented the little light, when you open your visor in your car and there's that light behind the mirror. He invented that.
Okay.
Yeah, so he had a bunch of money, and then he became a Navy SEAL anyways, and then he quit, and then he started Blackwater. And his I think his sister is actually Betsy DeVos. So he's married and also into a really rich family. So he has this sort of aristocratic background to an extent. He has the martial aspect, and I know he's a Catholic and he's fairly devout to some extent, but it's not a giant aspect of his personality.
So from my or from where I was going with spiritual and social, I didn't care so much about the martial ability, in that when I was saying aristocratic, it could be totally without that, as much as it is blue blood and leadership. Now, for my own personal preference, yes, I would want there to be a martial aspect, sort of that center where we've got the warrior. But yeah, my definition of aristocratic didn't necessarily need the martial.
Okay, how about this, where the spiritual and the social overlap, and that's in that aristocratic orange category? That would be like a archbishop.
Yeah, I could see that.
That's fine.
Yeah. Now I got a question for you, Wandering Panda. One of the things that you talked a lot about last time was the sort of highly tuned professional soldiers today who are not a part of any aristocratic class or warrior caste, but embody elements of the warrior spirit. Would that be the martial social overlap? Would that be where you put those men you were talking about?
Yeah, that would make sense to me, because if you look at the overlap too, there, that idea of training and recognition, in that we recognize that these guys are above and beyond your common soldier, your basically trained Marine soldier, whatever. So that makes sense to me.
Okay, because I'm trying to, given our last discussion, I'm trying to place some of the things we were talking about in these categories. Now, you had asked John Slaughter, what, 4 different people you mentioned, what, Alexander the Great, Robert E. Lee, where they would fit,
Yeah.
would you call them a warrior or not? Do you remember those 4 people?
Yeah, so I did, and I was intentional about this, in that I started with Alexander the Great, then I went to J.R.R. Tolkien, then I went to a Ronin, then I went to a recognized samurai, and then the last one was Robert E. Lee.
Okay, now where would you put each of those within this Venn diagram?
Sure. So for me, if we're going to start with Alexander the Great, I'm just going to throw him dead center for the most part. We quibble about that a little bit, but I throw him dead center. If we moved on to Tolkien, I'm going to throw him probably just in his violent capacity, let's say. I'm going to throw him just in the martial. If we move on to a Ronin, oh, let's see. Off top of my head, that one, I would probably keep him locked in the martial as well. And on Tolkien or the Ronin, you can run up here into discipline. And so the Ronin can sit more in martial. Tolkien can sit more sort of in this overlap of discipline between martial and spiritual. And then the samurai, like Alexander the Great, I'd go ahead and throw him in the middle, and the same with Robert E. Lee. And so I could dig into why I wouldn't place the Ronin there and why I wouldn't place Tolkien there, but that's where I would have placed the 5 of them.
So before we go any further, John Slaughter, do you sort of accept that disposition of the persons?
I haven't. I mean, there's a few areas I would disagree. I would honestly probably put Tolkien more in that martial social overlap, because I look at him as having a lot of social capital given his position within the university, and then obviously as an author. So I almost think he overlaps into the social. I mean, he has that. Now we know, that he has this sort of spiritual element with, his Catholicism and all, but that wasn't, again, a defining characteristic of him. So I would probably put him, in that martial social category to an extent. I think that's the only one I would necessarily have much of a gripe with. I have somewhat of a gripe with Alexander, only just because Alexander doesn't have. I mean, he views himself as divinely, as having a divine origin. If you believe that he believed what his mother said, so if we take that, then I would say, yeah, you could throw him in the middle.
So real quick before we go on, we have a comment from 3D Cow. When you guys bring up the samurai, are you meaning samurai before the Edo period? Because presumably after the Edo period, they're not really fighting wars anymore. So that's an interesting question. What would you say to that, Wandering Panda?
So that's an incredibly fair question, and I would have to bow out of that one, in that I'm recognizing samurai as sort of individual players and mixing in Bushido, but in fairness to the historical idea of it, I don't have enough knowledge to speak rightly on that.
John Slaughter, how would you answer that question?
Well, I don't want to be, I'm not trying to avoid the answer here, but a point I've tried to drill with this a lot is that there is a slow degradation of the warrior caste. So it's kind of hard to pin down when it completely goes away, because even if you look at Japan today, there's still people that trace themselves to the samurai that are like high up in business, like that bloodline. Those people are still successful. So I would be inclined to say before they're 100% part of the warrior caste, but that technology and time, history, all that slowly takes its toll. So it'd be hard to pinpoint an exact day to say, okay, they no longer are. But if they are no longer fighting battles, I think that's a fair line of demarcation.
Okay, I'll just say that when I speak of samurai, I would probably include them right up until the unification of Japan under the emperor for the second time. Because at that point, the samurai class is completely broken in this, what I think is called the Satsuma Rebellion. Even though they weren't fighting during the Edo period, I think that they still could count as a warrior class, and they certainly would duel each other, right? Think of like Miyamoto Musashi. This is maybe just quibbling, but I would say right up until the defeat of the samurai class completely in the Satsuma Rebellion, that's still samurai.
Is that Shirayama?
Yeah, that's actually what. Yeah, I would agree with that as well, because it's once Japan, becomes modernized, and yeah, you're defeated at Shirayama, right? That's probably it for them.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I'll just throw this out here now because it was early on. Super chat from Milton Walker for $19.99 US dollars. Thank you very much, because I know it's going to be great. Awesome.
Thanks, dude. That's awesome.
Okay, so Wandering Panda, you were going to say something before I brought in some of the chats.
Yeah, no worries. So when John was talking about Tolkien, I think every critique he made, that's fine. I'm with that. The only thing in particular is I was talking about Tolkien in his martial capacity, not how he was finally viewed at the end of his life, so to speak. So there was that going on, and there was a second thing. Oh, and so then Alexander the Great, when we start digging into him, and he views himself as the walking divine. Yes, but there was also within his particular culture, there was an acceptance of that. And that's sort of when it comes to warrior, one of the things where I think John and I there's a hard line between the two of us is that one, I accept that the warrior class does still exist, even if they're not operating in that capacity. And then two, that no one in this one, maybe I'm wrong, maybe John and I are closer than I realize, but no one can recognize themselves as a warrior as much as it's an external labeling mantle that is placed upon them, from my perspective.
Before you respond, John, I want to ask Wandering Panda this question. So in that middle, the true warrior category, is that where you put like a Templar or a Hospitaller?
You could. Yeah. I mean, that's where I would place them.
Okay. Yeah, because they meet all that criteria. There is also a holy order too. Okay.
Yeah. And I don't think for myself, the big one is the acceptance of violence. And once a culture, once the church, once the martial unit of that society recognizes them and accepts a particular amount of violence and force that is perpetrated by this particular cohort, that cohort then gets to carry the label of civilizational warrior.
Okay, and then one more thing. Lastly, so someone like just a regular monk, right, or what we might call loosely the prayer warrior, that would be the spiritual social overlap or the martial spiritual.
Tomato. It can go because discipline does exist within spirituality as well as within the martial overlap. And so this isn't necessarily on individuals as much as it is what is the operating capacity that they are walking in, if that makes sense.
No, that's fine. All right. So John, what are some of your thoughts on all these clarifications?
Well, I think the first thing is I'd agree to the extent, like, I do think the warrior still exists, just not in practical terms. Like I said, in my view, it's more of a metaphysical thing, that the caste has a spiritual element to it, and therefore that still exists within the society. And like I said, it sort of leaks out at times where it's allowed to, right? So there are people that are, let's say that there may be Navy SEALs, they may be Delta, guys like that. Some of those guys would have in another time been a part of the warrior caste, if that makes sense. So I do agree that they still exist, just not in their full capacity, I guess you could say.
So
right?
would it be fair? would it be fair to say that they exist outside of a historic context, such that lacking that context, they fail to meet the full definition of a warrior, even if in some other epoch they might have?
Yes, exactly. So basically, this is the historical time we're in, right? The spirit of the age, whatever terminology you want to use, does not have a space for them, right? They're cut off from that full potentiality, essentially, if that makes sense.
No, I get that. I think that's a pretty compelling. What do you think, Wandering Panda?
Yeah, that works for me, and that's sort of what I was trying to gather and hint at when I was talking on the last stream, and just this idea of, are we moving into the fourth age, and the consecutive ages are getting, sorry, again, it's all Tolkien references, but the continuing ages, the grandiose, both on the part of the divine and on the part of the heroes within the age, are becoming more and more degraded. And so the heroic action in this age may have just been what was normal in a prior age. And so I'm down with all that.
So I got a question, actually, because you just talked about the end of a lot of these norms. The first question I want to ask is, if we look at beginning with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the Mujahideen fighters, and then all the way up through the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, as well as conflicts in the Balkans, a lot of these, quote, Islamic volunteer fighters are called Ghazi. Ghazi historically means those warriors that expand the scope of Islam. Would you put, let's just call them loosely, all Ghazi warriors, would you put them in the middle category?
So for me, that gets into, so going back to the idea that it's this external idea, and I'm going to also reference your idea of the transnational in the last stream. It's so this gets into, as we get into a what am I trying to think, a more globalized society, then the world itself has to start saying, which of these sides are acting in honor. And yet it could get all propaganda, blah blah blah. Let's, if I grant the premise, were the Afghans at that point, were they operating with honor? Were they symbolic of their people? Was there a national acceptance of violence that spanned the martial, the social, and the spiritual? And are they fulfilling the duties of their nation? And so if they meet that, then I'm going to say yes, they're operating in a warrior's capacity.
Okay, John, what would you say about these Islamic modern day Ghazi fighters? Would you put them in the middle too?
Well, as much as it obviously pains me to say this, because I have a personal, I guess, vendetta to an extent with some of them, I would say yes. And one of the key reasons for this is that one thing we have to remember is that the warrior does not fight for specific. He can fight for his country, but he does not fight just for his country. He fights for something larger than that, right? He's not beholden to, the nation calls him up and says, you fight for this cause. He's fighting for not just his people, but defending the traditions and the culture of his civilization, so to speak, right? And so, in as much as we may disagree with them, you look at the Mujahideen, and they are largely fighting for that, versus in comparison to the Russian soldiers or the Soviet soldiers that are there, which are fighting for the Soviet government, for some abstraction, whatever. These other individuals fight outside of that. They could choose to fight. They could choose not to fight. They're not fighting for the government. It's not because they're paid. They're fighting because they're defending, their traditions, their religion, their culture, their people. And as misguided as that might be, that makes them more of a warrior in the traditional sense, in my opinion.
So could we also include Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis? I would be inclined to, for the same reasons.
Yeah, I mean, again, as much as I can have my issues with them from a purely definitional sense. Yeah, I would agree.
So that doesn't bother me at all, because the one thing that used to be, people could say it and it wasn't an issue, is that there were warriors on both sides, right? And it was so banal, but that's because all cultures accepted it. And then here lately, particularly post big mashup World War II, it's like we have to declare one side as evil, and it's all propaganda. And I know we get this; we're preaching to the choir, but yeah, it just makes sense to me that there can be warriors that operate on the other side.
Okay,
Well,
go
well,
ahead,
just
John.
real quick, I was going to say this is a point that Evola makes, I think, in Metaphysics of War, which is he says that one thing that the Templars and the Saracens give each other is the ability to go to paradise. So they offer each other that in their sort of in the meeting of these two warriors, and they recognize that within each other.
So here's my point. To your point, Wandering Panda, the fourth age, the end of the age, certainly in the West, what we've all been talking about, and I think we could even include Russia and China, though they're the East, are in this sort of like post-warrior epoch. But I think for whatever reason, Islam is recovering a warrior tradition. And I think there's a lot of reasons we could adduce for that, which might indicate, Wandering Panda, that what could happen is that would then induce Western and even other Eastern nations to reinvent that tradition as well to compete, because Afghanistan has been holding its own for a long time now. One could argue, like Xenophon said, that the army with the strongest soul wins. And if the Mujahideen fighters are just warriors with an unconquerable soul, that's why Afghanistan just still is an independent country. What do you think, Wandering Panda?
Yeah, so I'm mulling that one over right now, and I'm thinking like my initial reaction is to say yes, but then right behind that, I'm slapping myself in the back of the head, because to my way of thinking, there's no denying Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and yet they were crushed. Now, if you dig into Sitting Bull and Custer in particular, like, never mind. I'm gonna start wandering. Anyway, I think you're hitting on something there, and I think that so this jumping into catabolic collapse, as countries start sort of dropping into smaller segments or potentially bigger super states, but less nationalized ideas, it makes sense to me that the resurgence of the warrior and these particular ideas of honor within combat will reappear. Sorry, that was all over the place.
All right. What do you think, John Slaughter?
Well, I think as far as the unconquerable soul, I think that's true. I don't think that they're unconquerable, obviously, as sort of Wandering Panda alluded to when you look at Sitting Bull or some of the other more warrior tribes, the Native Americans, right? They can be defeated, but it takes a lot more than it would another people, right? Because they're not fighting for an army and money and things like that. They're literally fighting for the existence of their culture, which is a huge aspect of that. So I think that part is definitely true.
Okay, so then I guess an interesting question then is, if we all seem to be in agreement that Islam, I mean, maybe they never lost a warrior tradition, but however we want to parse it, they seem to have maintained elements. So then the question is, do you think that could spur other countries and cultures that are fighting them to develop a similar tradition as a counter? Wandering Panda.
So, and I will recognize bias here. I get to a point where I'm very hesitant to get too much into the weeds with Islam, because even between the Sunni and Shia split, there is a lot on one side worth praising and worth recognizing, and there is a lot on the other side which I would like to burn with a really hot fire. So if it's all right, I'm gonna swap out Islam, and I'm gonna say, let's take Japan for whatever reason they're fighting us, or South America, right? If Chile decides to start attacking throughout the world, and they're producing some sort of warrior class. So you're still fighting. We could even do this with China, right? So you're fighting, but there are, I don't want to call them ROEs, but there are recognized walks that the different warriors are taking. Yeah, it makes sense to me that one person has to make the first move. And as that happens, and as these edges sort of get both built up and smoothed out, that it's totally feasible that a warrior class that is recognized transnationally can exist.
All right, John Slaughter.
Well, I think, and I guess because I'm playing sort of the metaphysical card a lot on here, I think that it's possible, yeah. But I think one of the biggest issues here is that we can never overlook the religious element of it, right? The society has to recognize that, and unfortunately, as much as we might not like it, for whatever reason, and we could debate those reasons, a large portion of the Islamic world has retained the religion as being important. Now, whether or not that's a veneer in some Islamic countries or whether it's actually devout, that's up for debate. But I don't think that warrior caste can come out of China if there's no religious basis for it, and it can't come out of any other place without that, right? It could come out of America again, but you would have to have, you have the martial ability, you have people with the aristocratic, but where's the religious element in that? And what causes that to spring forth, a new religiousness or a new devotion? Because right now, most people who claim to be religious in the West it's not really, it's like that talking point about, can somebody in the modern world really believe in God the way a medieval peasant did? And it creates a lot of problems. And so I think until you have that element, it doesn't really work.
Okay, well, here's just an interesting thought experiment to throw out to further amplify distinctions. We often talk about how secular ideology can be a kind of surrogate religion. So someone could say that, for example, communism is an atheistic philosophy, but could be viewed, and often was viewed, as a surrogate religion, or even just a counter religion. One, would you two accept that as a possibility? And then two, could that generate a warrior caste or a warrior mentality? Wandering Panda.
Sure. So are we talking, and I'm sorry, I missed it. Was it atheism in particular, post-communistic atheism? Was that the idea?
Well, no, I'm saying that you could have a quote unquote atheistic religion, like, say, communism, in that it functions a lot like a religion, but there's no transcendent God. It's this material dialectic.
No, I don't think you could get there. And that's sort of, as John was just talking, what I was saying of, there's a lot of priors that I haven't gone into. And so if you take sort of this Dutton Neo-Byzantium idea, and that the lack of Darwinian pressures are Darwinian pressure, and that sort of the right-wing ascendancy is absolutely going to occur, sort of my idea of the Chinese warrior class is more of what they have been in the past, which is the idea of almost ancestor worship. And so taking the highest of what the culture has produced and elevating that. And I also, and we can start making arguments about the gay and how Puritanism affected different things, but sort of this post-Christian identity that the world operates in now. And so post-Christian, post The Hague, post Geneva. And so there are still these, if they're not outright spiritual ideas, they are a guiding hand on what we're supposed to say is and is not correct.
Okay, John Slaughter.
I think those sort of ideologies, insofar as they can function as a religion, can motivate people in a similar way, I think. But I don't see, to use a comparison here, right? I don't see that it can elicit the same fervor as if we look at the Vikings who think they're going to Valhalla, right? Or we think of Christians thinking they're going to heaven, or Muslims thinking they're going to paradise, or whatever. Part of their motivation within that structure is that they believe they're not scared of death, because for them death is not the end, right? And you even see this within, if you look at Native American warrior tribes, right? They may believe in a different sort of afterlife or a metaphysical plane, but that sort of motivates them as a driving force. And I think you can have secular ideas like communism that can get close to that, but it will never, I don't think it can actually replicate that in a way that I would say is close enough, in my opinion.
Okay, here's another question from 3D Cow. Could nationalism be a form of religion or a replacement for it? This actually is a very good question, because are the SS warriors? They certainly viewed themselves having this unique esprit de corps and a defender of the German people. Wandering Panda.
How spicy do you want me to get, Todd?
I mean, whatever you want to do, Wandering Panda.
Right. So it's a little bit sticky in that we have to start describing nation. For me, I'm going to go pre-French Revolution. I'm going to say use nation as a stand-in for tribe, for blood, for whatever else you want to add to blood. And so from my perspective, yeah, you can totally get to so in the sagas, in Christianity, in a way, man being made in the image of God, and the genealogies all throughout Europe and through many parts of the world, family and tribe have a very integral, even more than that, transcending and integral. Anyway, family is important, right? And so, yeah, I think within particular ideas, and again, this is a pre-modern translation of nationalism. Yes, that can absolutely operate as the foundational religion that gets the warrior class motivated and keeps them motivated.
Okay, do you agree with that, John Slaughter?
Yeah, I would. For the most part, I agree, because I do think that nationalism, to use a comparison to saying earlier that China, with ancestor worship, nationalism can get you a lot closer to that, right? Especially in a more traditional sense of, we thinking of the word nation, having to do with natal, having to do with blood, family, tribe. Again, there is real religious ancestor worship that has existed and does still exist in parts of the world. And that, as much as it doesn't have the metaphysical aspect, it operates very similar way. So I would agree that if we assume that they're fighting for that, then I would say I would agree with Wandering Panda.
Okay, I want to make a further comment about. I would agree with that as far as like nationalism and the SS, but to sort of show a little bit more for communism here, Ernst Jünger said that technology was the metaphysic of the 20th century. We might also say the 21st. And one, I think, very plausible reading of the Soviet Union is in a religious context. In that, yes, it was state atheist, but it worshipped technology. It believed that technology would save mankind. In many ways, so did other European countries, but the Soviets were, I think, uniquely committed to that. So could a kind of technics metaphysic, I'm not saying it did in the Soviet Union, but might a technics metaphysic produce a warrior class? Wandering Panda.
So this is sort of the orc idea in chasing technology. And from my perspective, as I trace these ideas, it seems like the end result of it is always a technology for the betterment of mankind to the ultimate detriment of mankind. And so while initially it starts out and operates as a religious transcendent idea, it then degrades into ultimately the destroyer of the individuals that were using it, because they end up relying on it rather than it transcending a particular idea.
I'm not saying that's false, but what I'm saying is that at the earlier stage, when it's more of quote religious like, could it, in theory, develop a warrior class?
Sure. So it could, and this is ultimately, and it's sort of tilting at windmills when I'm talking about this, because for a time it can carry that burden, and ultimately, though, I think it ends up lacking.
All right, I'll ask you that same question then, John Slaughter.
Well, I think both of the points y'all are making are valid. I think where I would push back and have to disagree is that if we understand the warrior caste as being these three different elements, the one element that it cannot have in any meaningful terms within a communist framework is a real aristocracy, right? Because part of that doctrine is is obviously this equality that has to exist. Now, obviously, we know it doesn't actually exist, because even in the Soviet Union, there are have and have-nots, and there are people that are above others. But it could not formally recognize an aristocratic class, which is an essential element of the warrior caste, without being very obviously contradictory. So I don't think it would work. I think it might get close on two of the fronts, but on the aristocratic front, it would fail, and therefore it wouldn't work.
Okay, well, at the risk of opening up a rabbit trail, there's a theory proposed by the writer George Watson that early socialism, including even Marx, was actually more of a right-wing reaction to capitalism, and that, say, by the time of the Cold War, a lot of that was forgotten because it was embarrassing to the already extant communist regimes. And one of the cases you can point to is the fact that Marx and Engels are inspired to use the concept of the cash nexus from Thomas Carlyle, and in fact are quite favorable of Thomas Carlyle's writings in general, and that they represent a kind of red Toryism, or a sort of red expression of an aristocratic sense. He mentions Ruskin, who was a sort of a red Tory and supported socialism in England. One, do you find that compelling? And two, if you do, that might actually provide, at least at some stage, the aristocratic element you're looking for. Wandering Panda first.
So this is interesting to me, because if you go back far enough, socialism sort of was existence, and yet within that existence, hierarchy still existed. And it's where we play off into ideas of noblesse oblige, and what is the requirement if a man is more capable, what is required of him. And at some point we either get into the beneficial monarchy, or we take the wild path into communism. And
Okay.
so go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I thought you were done.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking, I'm totally down with socialism operating as sort of the civilizational structure for the masses. But where I pull back and say, no, we can't go that far, is when we start denying hierarchy. And I don't know if that totally answered your question.
No, that's fine. John Slaughter, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's interesting because in Imperium, Yaki makes this point that once you begin to think, I'll paraphrase him, but he basically says, when you begin to think in terms of like noblesse oblige, you begin to think socialistically, right? Because once you recognize that there is a sort of a hierarchy, and that hierarchy owes something to the people below them, you are naturally thinking socialistically, right? And he also makes the argument that the spirit of the coming age is that it is socialistic, right? That's where everything is moving. Now he uses the term ethical socialism, which is sort of his sort of way of obfuscating the fact that what he really means is national socialism, right? In whatever country that is. But I think that is very different in its origin and everything from communism and from Marx, because even though there are elements of Marx which I would agree that could be seen from a right-wing perspective, and they are reacting against capitalism and mass industry, they take it in a left-wing direction automatically. And this is even a point that Bowden makes when Bowden says that Hegel is really a right-wing thinker, but that Marx takes Hegelianism and makes it left-wing. And so that really Marx's ontology is just left-wing Hegelianism. So in my opinion, I think he's always on the left and denies hierarchy.
Okay, I think there's one last interesting question to explore here. You guys both mentioned the importance of a warrior tradition rooted in a kind of spirituality that believes in an afterlife. So I guess my question is an afterlife necessary for that warrior tradition to develop? Because again, one could theoretically be a, quote, atheist and I'll be a, say, right-wing National Socialist on the one hand, or a sort of, if you take George Watson's position, a kind of, Bolshevik socialist who is still, at least early on, implicitly right-wing, and their worship of maybe the state, if you're a communist, or the race, if you're a National Socialist, is a kind of equivalent religious devotion, right? They express an equivalent religious devotion to their particular spiritual, metaphysical techne, if you will, but not in the way that would be like an Aztec warrior or a samurai or a knight. Is that something that we could accept or not? Wandering Panda.
So I really don't want to be trite with this. My simple response is no, it's not something we can accept, simply because I don't understand if, and maybe this is just my grugness, if you aren't operating for something transcendent, right? So whether Evla, whether, pick your religion, even Hindu and, hardcore polytheism, there's still something that you are operating for that will not only impact future generations, but pulls from past generations, and that you are operating within this line that enables you to act as a warrior, both for the future and pulling from the greats of the past. And if we are left with pure materialism, I don't understand how we can get to a warrior class. I don't even know how we can get to a functional society in pure materialism, but I know that's beyond the scope of this argument. So.
Okay, so I'll ask you the same question, John Slaughter.
I think you can get really, really close with something analogous to ancestor worship, even if that is, as spicy as it might be to say, even if that is from a racial aspect, right? Because that can function very closely to a spiritual and a transcendent, if you were thinking, if you're sort of connecting your bloodline, your people, whatever, as almost a metaphysical construct, that can get close. But I still think at the end of the day, it will fall short, because there has to be something that spurs you beyond anything, and a promise of something greater, which I think can be offered through something like ancestor worship, but cannot be offered through a purely material ideology, we'll say. And I think we see this play out as, like, people are not willing to die for material terms. They're not even really willing to die for just basic ideas. They'll die for other things like their people or their religion or God, but they're not necessarily going to die for capitalism or communism per se. Not in those terms.
Okay, so it seems then that the faith or spirituality element that you put in the middle there, Wandering Panda, entails an actual spirituality with an afterlife. And while through communism or fascism you could approximate that, assuming they're both atheist, that's only an approximation in an analogous way that a Navy SEAL is only an approximation. Would that be fair?
That would be fair, and as I'm sitting here thinking about it too, the only time really that the material realities are going to impact a fighting force, in my mind, is when they're fighting for something that they don't have, or when they are fighting for something that they perceive as an existential need for their civilization. But that still is limited towards this leveling, this great, weighing the balance. How much is it worth? How much do we sacrifice for it? And there isn't the idea of, I'm doing this because this is what is supposed to happen in a transcendent form. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Would you accept that, John, as well?
Yeah, I would. I would like to pose sort of an idea here, though. If we look at the two Koreas, right? We look at South Korea and North Korea. Even though North Korea is, for lack of a better term, communist, right? If they're, let's say they do have, highly trained individuals that do actually believe that the Kim family is divine, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to preserve that and protect that, it would be easier for them with that ideology to form a warrior caste in South Korea, which is purely, even though there's Christianity there and a large portion of the population is ostensibly Christian, they don't have the same devotion. And therefore, you could see in North Korea, it would be easier to develop a warrior culture or a warrior caste than it would be in South Korea, which is capitalist and very Western and has, the residue of Christianity.
Not to be too spicy, but post-Christian civilizations operate rootlessly.
Well, I think we've actually reached a consensus. I think we all broadly agree with your Venn diagram, Wandering Panda, and I think that's actually been a nice capstone to last month's discussion. What do you think, John?
No, yeah, I think I would agree completely. I think, if this conversation is to continue, really, I think we would have to kind of get into the weeds of like what we see as the possible situation that would allow for the rebirth of that class or that caste within the West.
Yeah. So yeah, good job, Wandering Panda. That was a great diagram.
Yes.
Well,
I feel
all right,
good.
everybody.
I'm clapping myself on the back.
Well, again, I think it's about time to wrap up. Do you have any last statements? I'll start with you, Wandering Panda.
No, this was great. I appreciate the platform. I had a lot of fun with you guys. The sort of what John was talking about just now, it is a wild idea to think of like what would a warrior class in the West in the future look like, because it's sort of there's a particular commentator I listen to, and he says he's betting against God, and sort of that idea, it is just sort of throwing ideas up there and trying to say, here's what it would have to contain and how do we get there, and is it likely that we will get there? So yeah, it's a crazy idea, and again, I'm just grateful for being here. So thanks, guys. Good conversation.
Yeah, thanks for being here too. John Slaughter, do you have any final thoughts?
I enjoyed it as always. Thanks for having me on. And I guess if people enjoyed this, the audience enjoyed it, and they want to see that further conversation, to just let you know, and I'll be more than glad to be back.
Yeah, I'm sure there's other nuances we can tease out, but again, tonight's episode was just to find a common basis, and I think we all did. So I think this was a really good success. So thanks again, Wandering Panda and John Slaughter, for coming on.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Have a good night.
You too. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.